Good morning. This meeting of the House Environmental Committee will now come to order. Mary, will you lead us in the pledge?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay. Evan, could you take the roll?
Vitale,
Present.
Brown, Leave, Fleming,
Leave.
Hohenstein,
Leave.
Isaacson,
Here.
Kazim,
Leave.
Mazzacco,
Leave.
Otten,
I believe Danielle's remote.
Pielli,
I'm online.
Leave.
Salisbury,
I'm here online.
Steele,
Mandy, I think Mandy's here also online.
Tiburcio,
Leave.
Takak,
Leave.
Webster,
Here.
Rader,
Leave.
Bashline,
Leave.
Day,
Present online.
Flick,
Online.
James,
On leave.
Kephart,
Online.
Mahaffey,
Leave.
Pugh,
On leave.
Stenger,
On.
Twardzik,
Leave.
Wentling,
Leave.
Zimmerman.
Leave.
Okay. Today we have a public hearing entitled Methane Emissions from the Oil and Gas Industry. Climate change is the most serious long-term threat to this planet. Methane, which is a primary component of natural gas, is the second most prevalent greenhouse gas after CO2. Its heat-trapping qualities are many times, perhaps as high as 86% that of CO2. The oil and gas industry is a major source of methane leakage. Methane can leak anywhere from the wellhead through pipelines, compressor stations, and right up to the burner tip of your gas stove in your house. Pennsylvania is the second largest producer of natural gas and thus a significant emitter of methane. Back in March of 2024, the Biden administration released methane regulations relating to the oil and gas industry for which the states need to comply. The Pennsylvania approach is the development of a general permit which incorporates the federal regulations by reference. The Trump administration, which has already exhibited a disdain for climate change, has rolled back these methane regulations and threatens to do this further. Pennsylvania has independent authority under the Clean Air Act to develop regulations relating to methane emissions, but is not doing so present. So one question is, why isn't Pennsylvania developing methane regulations based on its state authority? Today we will explore the issue of methane emissions from the oil and gas industry and Pennsylvania's approach to mitigating this. We have 7 speakers today. The first panel will be Seth Polepko, who is head of the oil and gas program, Ali Tarquinio-Morris, who is head of DEP's air program. Both the air program and the oil and gas program have a role in regulating methane emissions. They will be the first panel. The second panel will be Andre Restrepo from the Sierra Club and John Rutecki from the Environmental Defense Fund. Next, we will have Todd Papasergi from the Pennsylvania Independent Oil and Gas Association. The final panel will be Josh Eichenfeld from Earthworks and Alice Liu from the Clean Air Council. Each speaker will have up to 8 minutes of testimony, followed by questions from the members of the committee. Okay, if there's I don't know if anyone from your side has a comment. Very good. So with that, again, your segment will last up to 30 minutes. Each of you will have up to 8 minutes. So either of you can begin when ready.
Good morning, Chairman Vitale and members of the Pennsylvania House Environmental and Natural Resources Protection Committee. On behalf of the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, we'd like to thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony and really a chance to discuss the department's oversight when it comes to methane emissions from the oil and gas industry. In order to ensure sufficient time for dialogue, we do not intend to review our submitted testimony verbatim, but rather highlight some key areas and how they correspond to this topic. Allie and I combined will probably have, about 15 minutes or so, the bulk of which I will cover before handing it over to Deputy Secretary Tarquino Morris. So just wanted to set the table here at the beginning. The first topic I'd like to really discuss here is EPA's role when it comes to estimating greenhouse gas emissions associated with the oil and gas industry here in Pennsylvania. EPA administers what's known as the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program, and this is a regulatory program under which the oil and gas industry has annual filings that reports emissions. They report along with many other industrial sectors. These filings with EPA contribute to what's known as the National Inventory. This is an emissions inventory. The most recent draft compiling emissions data was submitted for public comment by EPA about a year ago, and it covers the period between 1990 and 2023. EPA also administers what's known as the State Inventory Tool, and they provide state disaggregated data. So some of the information that DEP included in its submitted testimony highlights emissions from the oil and gas sector. There are a few specific sources for 2022, and that was the most recent validated year of emissions that I called out here, and I'd like to just briefly present. Natural gas production represents about 9.35 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent here in Pennsylvania. Oil production about 0.01 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, and abandoned oil and gas wells represent about 2.5 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. One thing that I think it's important to point out here early on is that obviously at the federal level there has been some shift in policy when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions, and this could pose future challenges for Pennsylvania as we attempt to access emissions data that are compiled by EPA. The next topic I'd like to discuss really is more related to methane leaks, why it's important to reduce the associated emissions. For this portion of the discussion, I'm going to focus on Scope 1 emissions. These are emissions that are under direct control by the oil and gas operator. And I'm also going to focus on the upstream industry segment. So this is the exploration and production industry segment that drills the wells to bring the oil and gas to market. And this is what the DEP oil and gas program, this is the industry that DEP oil and gas program regulates. I do want to note, as Chairman Vitale pointed out, that natural gas is primarily comprised of methane. So we use these terms interchangeably at times when we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions. I also want to point out that the EPA global warming potential for methane is 25, and this indicates the potency of methane. This is compared to the benchmark gas, which is carbon dioxide. So methane essentially is 25 times more potent than carbon dioxide along the scale which that global warming potential is calculated. As oil and gas is developed in Pennsylvania, there are various stages of that development where natural gas emissions can be released to the atmosphere. So I want to cover these briefly. The drilling stage is the first stage of well development where an oil and gas operator is targeting a specific formation to produce oil and gas. The well is drilled in stages. Natural gas may be encountered even before they get to the target formation. That gas typically comes to the surface. It's managed at the surface. It can be routed to a flare. In some cases, operators will use drilling on mud. The mud is intended to keep the gas, the oil, any other fluids in the formation where they originate. So those are all different scenarios that could be encountered during the drilling of an oil and gas well. concurrent with drilling, the well construction begins. Each stage of the well is a process, if you will. A large diameter well bore is drilled, steel casing is in place, it is cemented in place. Most of the casing strings in Pennsylvania are cemented back to surface. What's happening here is we are introducing barrier elements in the well. These, again, are intended to keep gas, oil, and other fluids in the formation from which they originate. But they are subject to failure, and that is something we can talk about as another source of potential methane emissions. Most wells in Pennsylvania are completed by a technique known as hydraulic fracturing. There's a lot more water that's used, obviously, with shale development, unconventional resource development, than conventional development. As part of that completion process, there's a flowback period where fluids, including gas, come back to the surface. That is another potential opportunity for gas to be released to the atmosphere. This gas can be flared, it can be vented. In some cases, it's actually produced by operators in what's known as a green completion. And finally, the well will transition to the production phase. Typically, wells in Pennsylvania are produced for many decades. Those barrier elements we talked about, casing, cement, casing packers, wellheads, other valving, those are all potential sources where leaks can originate that would allow gas to, and methane, of course, to be emitted directly to the atmosphere. I do want to, one other thing I should say is at the end of the production life, operators are required to permanently plug and abandon wells. And at that point, the intent is to stop all flow of fluids to the surface, including gas. It is important to differentiate, I think, for this panel between vented gas and leaking gas. Leaks are typically associated with a failure of a well component that's designed to contain pressure. These are, what's known as well integrity failures, and they are tied to the well barrier elements that we talked about previously. Venting, on the other hand, is another operation where natural gas can be released to the atmosphere, but that is by design. Operators may open up valves to release gas to the atmosphere, and really the goal is to keep pressure off of certain components of the well and maintain well integrity during its operating life. I'm going to briefly discuss the regulatory responsibilities of the oil and gas program next, as they differ from the air quality program. Our main focus in the oil and gas program is really on managing natural gas leaks, making sure that vent flows are safe, and also ensuring well integrity. Those barrier elements we talked about have to function as designed. Operators have integrity programs, and the goal there is to prevent leaks, to manage vented gas scenarios in a way that gas is vented safely at the surface. We have regulations specific to that. And the oil and gas program obviously has inspection activities and oversight that we conduct in addition to the operators' well integrity programs. Our inspectors, most of them are equipped with fairly sensitive instruments down to the parts per million level. For reference, 10,000 parts per million of gas is equivalent to about 1% gas in air by volume. And so another regulation we have.
Seth, you're at the 8-minute mark, but I want you to continue a little further because you're starting to kind of get into what I'm interested in. So
Sure.
Just want you to be mindful of that.
Thank you. I apologize for going over here a little bit.
That's okay.
The operators are also required to monitor their wells quarterly and conduct mechanical integrity assessments, and they submit this information to the department on an annual basis. And DEP, the agency, can use this information to ascertain whether or not there's a mechanical integrity issue with the well that could be contributing to an escape of methane, natural gas. Usually we reference these data when we're conducting water supply investigations or other complaint investigations. I did provide some statistics about the mechanical integrity assessment program in my testimony. Happy to answer questions about them as well. And I also provided a summary of compliance data. If you look at some of the regulations specific to leaks, specific to well integrity, mechanical integrity assessments, you'll see that for the conventional side of operations, for the years 2023 through 2025, there were hundreds of citations associated with leaks and failure to report mechanical integrity assessment data. For the unconventional industry, the numbers are much lower, single digits to several dozen in some cases. Again, for matters related to leaks at wells and also submitting mechanical integrity assessment data. The last thing I'd like to cover here is related to our plugging program. Many of you may know DEP has been awarded roughly $215 million through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. These are grants that are administered by the United States Department of Interior, and we're using that grant money to decommission abandoned wells that do not have any responsible party in the state. As of the time of drafting of this testimony, we've plugged and abandoned 381 wells. Since the beginning of Governor Shapiro's term, most of that well plugging activity has been funded through the federal IIJA funds. There are other minor sources of funding that we also utilize to conduct that work. And I'd like to make a point here about emissions reduction tied to well plugging, and this is my last point here.
Kind of wrap it
So
up.
historically, DEP has plugged over 3,700 wells dating back to 1989. You can use some assumptions to estimate that this has reduced, it's avoided emissions by about 500 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So we really view our plugging program as another opportunity to reduce greenhouse gas emissions here in the Commonwealth. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ally?
Thank you, Chairman Vitale, and other members of the committee, and thank you, Seth, for that great overview. Quickly touching on an overview of the department's air program, DEP's air program is obligated to meet the requirements of the Federal Clean Air Act, and it also has the power to establish regulations for the prevention, control, and reduction of air pollutants. In the sector of oil and gas industry operations, the existing regulatory techniques, including emissions guidelines, permitting, and performance standards, typically apply to pieces of equipment that are associated with an oil and gas well, such as storage vessels, dehydrators, or fugitive emissions components. So those are the valves and the flanges, gaskets, separators that Seth spoke to in his testimony. Over the last 13 years, the department has made significant progress in the regulation of methane from the oil and gas industry. These regulatory tools that have been in place since 2013 include requirements for methane emissions from both unconventional and conventional sources. The department has addressed methane emissions from the oil and gas industry sector through state emissions requirements, which were first established in 2013, the development of permits in 2018 that establish methane thresholds and require methane emission reductions for various sources related to oil and gas exploration and production. The VOC rulemaking, which was promulgated in 2024, regulates methane indirectly through the regulation of VOCs, and the new source performance standards, which were administered in 2024, include methane reduction requirements on common oil and gas industry sources. In addition, currently the department is in the process of identifying how it will implement the requirements of the federal methane rule, which regulates methane more directly. In 2024, EPA issued emissions guidelines that require states to develop a state plan to address methane emissions. Because of the initial short regulatory deadline for the submission of the state plan, DEP proposed to develop general permits as the legally and practically enforceable methane rule. DEP solicited public comment on its draft state plan and received 10,000 comments on the proposal. The department is currently evaluating options in order to issue a final state plan that addresses public comment, fulfills current federal and legal obligations, and best prepares Pennsylvania to deal with any future federal policy changes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, very good. So we have some time for questions. I mean, I will, again, this is a bit of an in-the-weeds area, and I don't tend to be an expert here, but so the federal regs came out under the Biden administration in March of 2024, so over 2 years ago. The approach the DEP is taking with regard to the general permit is to incorporate by reference those federal regulations as opposed to drafting its own regulations. So given that Trump's denial of climate change and his already weakening of these federal regs and the threat to further weaken, why are we taking the approach of incorporating these federal regulations by reference as opposed to developing regulations based on independent state authority under the Clean Air Act? I mean, from a layman's perspective, it seems like we're just building a castle on sand, something that is likely to collapse over time. Why are we taking this approach as opposed to developing regulations based on the Clean Air Act?
Thank you for that question, Chairman. DEP is analyzing the possibilities for implementation of that federal methane rule, and as stated, when it was initially brought forward, the deadlines to comply with it were such that the incorporation by reference and the development of general permits was the most expeditious path forward that would satisfy our federal obligation to submit a state plan to EPA that was also approvable by EPA. One of the things that needs to happen, as you correctly note, the department does have the authority to develop regulations based on its legal authority under the Air Pollution Control Act. However, further study is required to determine whether additional reductions can be attained and justified in accordance with state law. And it also requires us to have available Pennsylvania-specific data on oil and gas facilities, businesses, and economics. But that is certainly among the options that is currently being evaluated in response to public comment.
I know, and I think you know too, that the DEP is significantly understaffed. And it's been suggested that one reason this approach is being taken is you just don't have the people in the air program to do the legwork necessary with regard to these regulations. Can you comment on that?
I don't believe the decision-making was relative to staff. Honestly, it was really dictated by those federal deadlines. And as it stands today, I mean, still under the existing federal requirements, we are obligated to provide a state plan to EPA for review by January of 2027. So I don't know that it necessarily has to do with a manpower issue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for having this meeting. Your work in the environmental space is well noted by me in my 16th year, and I appreciate the work that you're doing here. Make a quick suggestion rather than do it under parliamentary procedure or anything like that. Just make a friendly suggestion that I'm going to have a question in a moment, but just talking about the federal policies in a derogatory way, I don't think it helps with what your career has done in the environmental space.
Okay,
so
duly
noted.
Noted.
Thank you so much, and I appreciate that. And I want to thank the folks who just testified because they did an absolutely outstanding job of talking about leakage. I'm glad you brought up the old well plugging effort. I'll have a specific question about that just to gather more information about where we are in that process. But there's three components in my question: old well plugging, agricultural operations, and oil and gas operations. It seems like the chairman is guiding toward oil and gas operations. So I think we're going to cover that fine. And I think you guys are doing a great job with that. I know Pennsylvania is working on an overall methane plan within the overall DEP plans and guidelines. But could you tell us, where are we with 3,700 wells plugged? Where are we? What was the estimate of the total? I forget the number. I know it's almost, it feels like an infinite number sometimes, but where are we in that process? You did mention the amount of tonnage that you estimate that it's the 3,700 has helped to curb out of the atmosphere. The second thing is with agricultural operations, does manure injection operations help with this at all? I know it does help with sedimentation in this Chesapeake Bay corridor.
I think Rep Day, I mean, your first part of your question is totally relevant, but I think second might be straying into a different topic. So I'm just going to keep the focus in on the oil and gas industry. If we can just do that, that would be great. Let's let Seth let Seth answer what you've asked to date.
Mr. Chair, just to qualify or clarify, what I'm trying to do is understand if my lay question is correct or incorrect with the professionals that we have before us. So I would appreciate if they would just give us their take on whether manure injection helps. I suspect
We're
it might, but I'm not sure.
Rep Day, we're just focusing in on methane emissions from the oil and gas industry. We're not focusing on agriculture today. So I would just ask Seth if you could just answer the question with regard to the oil and gas industry, and we'll just move along.
Sure. Thank you for the question, Representative Day. With regard to legacy well management, if you will, there are estimates. I guess we'll start by saying we're aware we have about 27,000 documented orphaned and abandoned wells. There has been research, peer-reviewed research completed that indicates there could be hundreds of thousands of wells that have not been identified just because of the long history of development here in Pennsylvania. The number I had provided earlier in the testimony was that we estimate about 500 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent have been removed since the first well was plugged under the state's well plugging program, which started around 1988, 1989. So that's why we view this as an opportunity to make impacts here. So a few things we're doing concurrently. We're looking at our options for scaling up our well plugging activities. We had released what are called requests for proposal contracts. We're moving toward awarding, and that will allow us to mobilize contractors much more efficiently. They'll be on-call contractors, essentially, that we can get them out to the site and conduct plugging activity without all the intervening procurement steps. We're also looking at standing up a methane emissions measurement program, so that quote I gave you, that emissions number I gave you, will be much more precise in time. It will not rely on a generic emission factor, but rather measurement data here in Pennsylvania. And in concert with this, we're currently using some of our federal funding to support a well location program. So we have contracts with universities. They're digitizing old maps, and we're also going to have a service provider that can start to field verify those locations so we have a better sense of the universe of documented wells.
Okay, thank you. I just want to add one thing before we get to Rep. Isaacson, and you stated that the Shapiro administration has plugged over 300 wells, but I just wanted to make clear that based on data the DEP provided, in an equivalent time period, well over 1,000, maybe as high as 1,300 wells have been abandoned, and that is based on DEP data that shows wells currently abandoned and wells that were not considered abandoned 3 years ago. So, I mean, you will concede that during this time period where 300 some wells were plugged, perhaps as many as triple were abandoned.
I would say a couple of things are important to consider there. Those are, my recollection is those are potentially abandoned sites, so there are other tools that the department can use to see if they can find a responsible party or someone who would have obligations to plug and abandon those wells. There's a long process that we would go through in terms of due diligence to ensure there's no financially viable responsible party before we would exercise our authority to plug and abandon a well. I will also say that this is, to your point, Chairman, this is an area of focus for the agency right now. In concert with our well plugging activities, it's very important to pursue enforcement activity and mitigate the potential for future abandonment. So we've introduced some new IT tools and efficiencies to really stop adding to that population of abandoned wells with no viable responsible party.
Thank you. Rep. Isaacson?
Thank you. And I see our time is moving along really quickly here, so I'll kind of scale back my question. In your testimony, you talked about the national inventory, for basically 33 years of inventory data was provided in the last release, but that was in 2023. Is it on the federal government or is it on you to continue the inventory in Pennsylvania going from 23 on? And, or is it still, that's still something we need somehow for the federal government to keep updating, or are they? Because if, do you understand what I'm asking? And if so, if it is incumbent upon you, is this something that DEP has had to create? And going back to staff and fund, the regulatory oversight, is that something we need to help address so that you can do it adequately?
Thank you for the question, Representative Isaacson. The state has relied on federal data, as I mentioned in my testimony. There is a lag time. My understanding is before the data are finalized and released as validated, there tends to be a 3-year lag time, and that's why we're operating behind. But this is that process, that vetting process, I understand, is advanced by EPA. I don't believe the agency yet knows the impacts of changes in policy when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. There have been some indications about, rollbacks of the greenhouse gas reporting program. I know for some of the oil and gas sources, we rely on EPA emission factors, and then we take our own inventory of certain assets, active wells, active oil and gas wells, abandoned wells, and use those emission factors to derive an estimate. I don't have deep expertise here, so I'd need to consult with my colleagues and other programs to really get a more refined answer. But there is some risk here if EPA changes its trajectory, and I do think it would be important for the state to look at other alternatives for maintaining a transparent and reliable accounting of greenhouse gas emissions moving forward.
Okay, in the interest of time, thank you so much. And if there is any further information that you can get from maybe one of your experts, if you forward it on, would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.
Rep. Gephardt?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I have a question for the DEP, and that, in your testimony that you wrote before the committee, it says the section that says what happens if EPA regulations are weakened. In the second paragraph, last sentence, you make note that any further rulemaking affecting conventional and unconventional oil and natural gas industry sources must be undertaken separately, one for each industry. However, there's some concern that Act 52 was never fully implemented yet. So my question is to ensure that these are separate, because, we have some friends in the state that, have small stripper wells that are very different from the unconventional industry. What would this look like that we have two separate accounts for this? And then second of all, if our guys are supporting this, would you support a conventional oil and gas act that would separate it completely from the unconventional industry? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, thank you for that question. I think the testimony is accurate as written. It's our understanding at the department that those rulemakings would have to be undertaken separately. And so the process, if the department were to move forward with a rulemaking, would be similar to the process that we followed for other rulemakings involving this industry sector, where there is one put forward for the unconventional sector and a separate rulemaking put forward for the conventional sector.
Okay.
Would they be different? Would they be just a quick follow-up? Would they actually be different in their effect?
That's a good question, and I think that's something that probably needs to be fleshed out through that deliberative process that is contemplative of public input and economics and feasibility. There might be different considerations for each industry sector, but I think the main thrust of the rulemaking would be very similar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, thank you. Rep. Webster, go our final question for this panel.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually have a really long-winded academic question that I'm going to avoid completely because of time and save you from that. If you would, as another layman said earlier, I certainly raised my hand in that category. Can you help me understand, we talked about the emissions, I'm trying to get the overall grasp of drilling a well, producing oil or gas, and the abandoned ones. Am I missing like the generation stage where now we're burning gas, and why is that separate from like the way we're calculating?
I did, thank you, Representative Webster, for the question. I did try to qualify my testimony that I would be primarily focusing on what is known as Scope 1 emissions, and those are, either fugitive emissions, process emissions that are under the direct control of the oil and gas operator. There are, of course, other scopes for emissions, Scope 2 and Scope 3 would get more at the emissions that you're referring to. When the oil is delivered to market, it's combusted, there are associated emissions, CO2 primarily associated with that process, but we did not cover that as part of this
Just
testimony.
briefly, what's Scope 2, so I get the whole
Scope 2
path here.
is, Scope 2 emissions are basically emissions that an entity might use for power generation. If they, for electricity, for instance, what sort of emissions are associated with the fuel source that's used to generate that electricity. So again, not under direct control of that entity.
So if I understand, Scope 2 would be like electricity generation, Scope 3 is actually heating or burning the fuel for
Exactly.
directly. Okay.
It's all those global emissions tied to a product that an oil and gas operator might distribute to the market.
Okay, thank you, and thank you both. Really appreciate your coming today and your excellent testimony and your excellent response to questions. I just want to say that I know the DEP does a great job with the personnel they're given. You have very committed people, and I respect you greatly, despite other things that I might say. I have a great deal of respect for the DEP.
Thank you so much, Chairman.
Okay.
Thank you. Much appreciated.
Thank you. Okay, our next panel will be Andres Restrepo from the Sierra Club and John Rutecki from the Environmental Defense Fund. Looks like we have John is in person and Andres is remote. So I don't know if either of you have a preference for going first, but whoever wants to go first, who wants to go first?
I'll go first. I think I'm first on the agenda.
Okay, go ahead. Fire away then.
Okay, great. Thank you, Chairman Vitale, Chairman Rader, and members of the committee for inviting me here to share my views on this important topic. My name is Andres Restrepo, and I'm joining you today from Chestnut Hill, Philadelphia. I'm a senior attorney with Sierra Club, where I've worked for over 12 years on issues relating primarily to climate change and clean air. Founded in 1892, Sierra Club is the nation's oldest and largest grassroots environmental organization. Sierra Club currently has over 600,000 dues-paying members in 64 chapters, covering all 50 states plus the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico. The club's Pennsylvania chapter, which is organized into 11 local groups, currently has over 24,000 members. In 2005, Sierra Club's members voted to make fighting climate change the organization's highest priority. In the 2 decades since, the club has worked tirelessly to reduce greenhouse gas emissions using all the advocacy tools at its disposal. Sharply curbing methane emissions from the oil and gas sector is critical to achieving our goal, and indeed is a necessary component of any approach to fighting climate change. Methane, or CH4, is the primary component of natural gas. An extremely powerful greenhouse gas, in the first 100 years after its release, methane is over 30 times more effective at trapping heat in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide. In the first 20 years after its release, methane is over 80 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. Globally, methane is responsible for approximately 1/3 of the warming that the planet has experienced to date. Simply put, there can be no effective solution to climate change without a dramatic reduction in methane emissions, and the United States must be at the forefront of this effort. According to data published by the World Bank, the U.S. is second only to China in global methane emissions, contributing nearly 9% of the world's totals each year. U.S.-based emissions impose huge costs on society through their climate impacts. Using EPA's rigorously developed social cost of methane metric, as well as data from both the World Bank and EPA's greenhouse gas inventory, we find that methane emissions from U.S. sources impose no less than $35 billion in costs on society each year, and as much as nearly $80 billion. The oil and gas sector is a key source of this pollution. Now the world's largest producer of both oil and gas, the U.S. is also the world's largest emitter of methane from the oil and gas industry. As the nation's leading gas-producing state after Texas, Pennsylvania makes an outsized contribution to these emissions. EPA's greenhouse gas inventory lists Pennsylvania's oil and gas methane emissions at approximately 489 million metric tons in 2022. And just to clarify, that's absolute tons in methane, not on a CO2 equivalent basis, imposing nearly $680 million and $1.2 billion in climate damages per year. To make matters worse, a large portion of methane emissions go undetected and unaccounted for, and so the true extent of this problem is almost certainly worse than official statistics would suggest. Fortunately, there are readily available technologies and practices that can greatly reduce these emissions. The vast majority of methane released during oil and gas operations escape through one of three ways. First, accidental equipment leaks, including extremely large releases known as super-emitter events. Second, through the use of equipment that is designed to vent to the atmosphere, such as gas-driven pneumatic pumps and process controllers. And third, the practice of flaring associated gas produced at oil wells that could be captured and routed to a pipeline with the right equipment. Oil and gas operations can address these problems by, respectively, 1. Regularly surveying facilities for leaks and making rapid repairs of malfunctioning equipment. 2. Using the most state-of-the-art technology that minimizes or eliminates venting of gas to the atmosphere. And 3. Capturing all gas that is produced at oil wells and routing that gas to a pipeline for sale rather than flaring it. Research indicates that adopting a full and comprehensive suite of control measures can cut sector-wide emissions by approximately 65%, achieving a huge reduction in climate pollution for modest costs. These methane abatement strategies have the added benefit of reducing other harmful pollutants. Alongside methane, oil and gas sites emit large quantities of hazardous air pollutants such as benzene and formaldehyde, which are known human carcinogens, as well as volatile organic compounds, which react in the atmosphere to form particulate matter, also known as soot, and ozone, also known as smog. Particulate matter and ozone damage pulmonary and cardiovascular health, contributing to asthma attacks, shortness of breath, missed school and work days, ER visits, heart attacks, and premature death. 8 million Pennsylvanians, over 60% of the state's population, live in one of 17 counties that have levels of ozone that exceeds EPA's federally permanent limits. Thus far, however, Pennsylvania has not taken steps necessary to ensure that its oil and gas producers limit their emissions of methane and other associated co-pollutants. Several other oil and gas producing states have taken such action. Colorado first adopted direct comprehensive methane controls in 2014, with California following suit in 2019 and New Mexico in 2021. Yet Pennsylvania, despite producing more natural gas than those three states combined and achieving its highest ever gas production total in 2025, still has declined to adopt mandatory direct methane standards, as distinguished from VOC standards at the state level. In 2016, the federal EPA issued Clean Air Act standards requiring many important methane control measures at new and modified oil and gas sites, but declined at that time to cover already existing facilities, which account for 80 to 90% of all emissions. Indeed, in Pennsylvania, over 90% of wells currently listed as active by DEP were drilled before the effective coverage date of the 2016 EPA regulation. The Biden administration took steps to address this gap in 2024, not only strengthening methane standards for new and modified sources, but also issuing emission guidelines for existing sources. Under this federal Clean Air Act program, states adopt regulatory control plans to cover methane from existing oil and gas sources within their borders and submit those plans to EPA for approval. If EPA approves a plan, it becomes federally enforceable. If the plan is inadequate, or if the state chooses not to participate, EPA will create its own federal plan for existing sources within that state. In principle, EPA's 2024 rule lays the groundwork for full comprehensive methane control at both new and existing source oil and gas sources nationwide. Unfortunately, what is true in principle can be stymied in practice. Since the second Trump administration took office in 2025, EPA has already taken steps to delay the effective compliance dates for most aspects of the 2024 methane rule, including a delay of 10 months for states to submit their existing source implementation plans to the agency, despite an initial allowance of 2 years. More recently, EPA finalized a rule that would relax limitations on flaring of associated gas at oil sites, and the agency has signaled that it will initiate an additional broader reconsideration effort later this year that will likely further erode the 2024 rule's protections. The agency has also proposed to suspend for 10 years oil and gas companies' obligation to simply report their greenhouse gas emission totals to EPA. Finally, while doing so would run afoul of federal legislation passed in 2021 and would certainly face vigorous court challenges, the current EPA may at some point attempt to rescind altogether federal standards for methane under the Clean Air Act. The reality is that Pennsylvanians cannot count on the current administration to protect them from methane and other harmful emissions from the oil and gas sector. Following in the footsteps of California, Colorado, and New Mexico, DEP must forge ahead now with the most protective possible methane controls, adopted standards that are informed by and at least as strong as those included in EPA's Biden-era methane emission guidelines for existing sources. Even if the current EPA weakens, delays, or seeks to abandon federal methane requirements that are currently on the books, the Clean Air Act grants states full authority to adopt and enforce stationary source standards, including methane controls for the oil and gas sector, that are more protective than federal requirements and that apply as a matter of state law even when the federal government declines to take action. While DEP took initial steps towards developing such methane standards under Governor Wolf, those efforts ultimately stalled. It's time for DEP to finish the job and waste no time in adopting strong and protective methane standards for the oil and gas sector that benefit all our families and communities in Pennsylvania. Thank you.
Thank you. John?
Chair Vitale, Chair Rader, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity. My name is John Rutecki. I'm a Regulatory and Legislative Manager for Environmental Defense Fund. EDF uses science and economics and has over 150,000 members in PA, and we've worked to identify practical solutions that benefit all of Pennsylvania. And we've been working for the last decade on oil and gas methane policy here in Pennsylvania. And so my core message is simple. Pennsylvania does not have to choose between a strong oil and gas industry and clean air. We can have both, and Pennsylvanians support action. What remains is the hard but achievable work of getting policy correct. As the second largest producer of natural gas, and like any other major industrial sector, there's emissions associated with it. In 2023, Pennsylvania emitted an estimated 1 million metric tons of methane, and that is valued at $178 million. And that would be enough to meet the heating and cooking needs of every house in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh combined for a full year. Now we better understand where emissions come from. A peer-reviewed study in 2022 found that low-producing marginal wells, those are wells that produce 15 barrels of oil equivalent or less per day, represent roughly 80% of all gas production sites, but only account for 6% of national production. And despite that small share of output, these sites are responsible for roughly half of all the oil and gas methane emissions nationally. Pennsylvania reflects that national pattern. There's about 75,000 marginal wells here in Pennsylvania, and they are responsible for about 48.5% of the oil and gas methane pollution. And that makes regulation of existing sources an essential aspect of any policy. If you look at recent basin-wide measurement data, this is with independent aerial and satellite studies, the basin here in the Appalachian Basin has a methane intensity of 0.5 to 0.6%. While that places you as one of the lower emitting basins in the country, it still falls short of voluntary industry standard of 0.2% methane intensity. So, with the common sense regulatory floor that regulates all wells, we can continue to drive down emissions. But acknowledging that all existing wells should be covered does not mean ignoring legitimate operational realities. This is where pragmatic policy matters. So while operations vary widely, we do hear that there could be a hardship on small marginal well operators. But we must be clear-eyed about this. The data does not show that it's just small family operators operating these marginal wells. There's a wide spectrum. And this includes some of the largest and most well-capitalized companies in the industry. So the mom-and-pop framing while it fits a small number of operators, does not describe the majority of well ownership. So we should not allow legitimate challenges facing a subset of operators to become a rhetorical shield that prevents action for the entire sector. So at the same time, good policy should be flexible. And I think the federal methane rule provides exactly that kind of flexibility. It was not designed to be one size fits all, it was designed to be pragmatic. That flexibility should be a starting point for any Pennsylvania methane policy. So if there's operators who cannot meet these challenges, we should listen, we should engage during a stakeholder process. But I think it tells us something about the economic viability of those wells. So rather than doing that, we should consider proper plugging rather than leaking indefinitely and passing the costs on. Pennsylvania's economy related to methane, your methane mitigation industry is a growing segment. You have about 51 company locations here with skilled local jobs that can't be offshored. So if you establish clear policy and a regulatory floor, you create conditions for sustained investment in good Pennsylvania jobs. We know the natural gas markets are changing. Buyers are increasingly scrutinizing methane intensity. So the EU has their methane intensity standards. Japan and South Korea have their clean initiative aimed at reducing LNG methane emissions. More than 150 countries have signed the Global Methane Pledge. Pennsylvania's gas industry will increasingly be asked to demonstrate that their production can meet these standards. So a clear, consistent framework will allow the operators and give them the credibility to access these markets and have a competitive advantage over operators who do not. The U.S. Energy Information Administration projects that natural gas prices will rise by 30% over 2025 levels by 2027. They attribute this to LNG exports and power demands from data centers. So every cubic foot of gas that is wasted is one that's not available for consumers. Reducing waste can also be an affordability strategy. Pennsylvania is in an active conversation about the growth of data centers. While we think clean energy should power this industry, we do recognize that much of the near-term need may come from gas. So if gas is going to power that, it should be produced as cleanly and responsibly as possible. But methane's not the only concern. You've heard about co-pollutants, volatile organic compounds. Know that 1 million Pennsylvanians live within a half-mile of active oil and gas. Peer-reviewed research, even here in Pennsylvania, documents proximity and the health outcomes for people that live near these operations. So when we reduce this waste, it's also a benefit to Pennsylvania communities. And it's one of the strongest reasons this work matters. But Pennsylvania's not starting from scratch. You just heard from DEP. They've been working on this issue for more than a decade. It's a continuation of the work they're already doing thoughtfully and with technical expertise. So in our view, they're the right entity to continue leading this type of policy development. And while we hear that the federal landscape is evolving, it really underscores why Pennsylvania would benefit from having its own durable state-level protections, and Pennsylvanians want it. During the 60-day public comment period, we had a wide and diverse group of individuals supply comments and support. It represented a true cross-section of the Commonwealth. And recent polling also supports this. January 2026, it looked at Pennsylvania voters who supported adopting stronger regulations to reduce methane emissions from oil and gas industry, and it was supported by a 42-point margin. So they obviously believe it will be good for Pennsylvania. So I do want to return to where I began. This is not a choice between a healthy industry and a healthy environment. The data shows we can have both. The authority rests with DEP. They're the right agency. What remains is the work to get this policy right. We should cover and ensure we have protections for all wells, build in flexibility to address operator circumstances, draw on the experience of other states. They've shown that you can have a healthy industry along with standard good methane protections, and it means allowing DEP to continue that work so that Pennsylvania ends up with strong and durable protections to serve the Commonwealth for years to come. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. I'll start out, and this is directed to both of you. Is it safe to say, you mentioned the word durable, and is it safe to say that you have concerns with the DEP approach to implementing the federal rule, which is based on incorporating federal regulations by reference as opposed to using its own independent authority? Is it safe to say there are concerns with this approach?
I appreciate your question. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, John.
No, please. He was looking at me, and I wasn't sure if it was directed at me or not. So,
Yeah, Chairman Vitale, I can answer that. The thing about this is actually not a difficult problem to solve. So the federal emission guidelines are currently in the Code of Federal Regulations, okay? And the way that it works is that states adopt, if they choose to participate, they can't be forced to participate, but if they choose to participate, they adopt a state plan, submit that, and that becomes part of state law, and then they submit it to EPA for approval. If EPA approves it, it becomes also part of federal law. The state DEP, what's in the 2024 emission guidelines is by and large a strong, set of requirements. That we had some things that we wanted them to go further on, but it's a strong set of requirements. Instead of simply cross-referencing to the Code of Federal Regulations, DEP could just essentially use the same language, but just adopt that same language independently rather than having a cross-reference. I mean, it's not quite as simple as just copying and pasting the text and then passing a regulation that includes that copied and pasted text, but it wouldn't be that far off from that. Now, we do think that there's areas in which DEP, as a matter of substance, could go further than what are in those emission guidelines, and they have authority to do so. But if the concern is that we don't want to have a situation in which DEP cross-references the federal emission guidelines, those later get weakened, and then therefore simply by operation of law, the Pennsylvania regs get weakened because they cross-reference those federal regs. That's something that can be avoided. And I understood the DEP speaker's concerns about, they were concerned that they didn't have time to do a comprehensive review, and so that's why they cross-referenced. Simply, again, by just using the federal emission guidelines as the blueprint, but just not doing that that incorporation by reference technique would be a way that they would still be able to get the benefit of relying upon what the Biden EPA did in developing those emission guidelines without running into the risk of having your own regs basically rise and fall with whatever happens at EPA. So does that make sense?
Yes, I sort of raised the question why they didn't do that.
Yeah, and it would not require many resources at all. It could probably be done in an afternoon or two.
Okay. John?
Thank you for your question. I would not say I have a concern. It's more related to the federal uncertainty. So, I mean, we advocate for common sense policy. I mean, the EPA rule has a lot of good information in it, but, we think for durability's sake, not knowing what is happening at the federal level, that you utilize that authority and implement state, rules through your state authority. So, we really do expect a further reconsideration of those rules. So I think it's in the best interest of, I think the whole win-win we talk about, I think it's good for the industry. I think it allows them to have that certainty when they look to invest here in Pennsylvania. I think it's good for our frontline communities impacted by the pollution there as we address them and consider reducing emissions. So I would just say it's not a concern. I think DEP, has that experience and knows what they need to do to implement this. They're just working through, that uncertain process at the federal level.
Thank you. Rep. Gephardt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I have a question for both. First, to Sierra Club. You asserted in your testimony that, Pennsylvania doesn't have its own methane regulations and so forth. And but I believe, though, especially for like the unconventional wells, as they're bigger and would, produce more, that if they go over a certain limit of VOC or methane, they actually have to get a special permit. And then that permit requires them to reduce their methane leakage or other VOCs, for instance, by 95%. It is a special permit they have to get. Isn't that effectively the regulation that you want anyhow that's already implemented? The second question would be for EDF. You said earlier that you don't want the small mom and pop type guys to basically bleed over to, not go after the bigger implementers. And I get what you're getting at with that. So my question for you is, would you support a separate conventional oil and gas act, smaller guys, and then have different law for the unconventional? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Representative Kephart, for that question. So my understanding is that, yes, there is a general permit that applies, but it does not apply to the same, first of all, it doesn't apply to the same universe of sources that are covered under the EPA regulations that, that again, we support, but that we would like to see Pennsylvania adopt with more comprehensive controls. It's not just wells, for instance, it's also, there's limits on flaring of associated gas that's produced at oil wells. It has limitations on pneumatic equipment, including pumps and controllers. It has limitations on compressor stations, on liquids unloading events, and various other pollution points. It doesn't just cover conventional or unconventional wells. It covers all kinds of wells, which I know is something that you just raised, but the EPA regulations are more comprehensive in that regard. And then finally, the way that emissions, these are not point source emissions. So you can't easily determine how much you're leaking or how much you're emitting, right? It's like, so long as you follow certain steps, you're deemed to have met these certain requirements. And so the way that those Pennsylvania regulations, at least to the best of my knowledge, work, or those permit requirements work, is that it's not actually that difficult to avoid a situation where the requirements of the general permit apply. So in practice, you don't get the same kinds of emission reductions that you would otherwise get. So I don't mean to imply that there's no legal architecture at all in Pennsylvania. There is, and I appreciate that the state has taken this seriously. I think just what we haven't seen is what we have seen in a place like California, Colorado, New Mexico, where independent entirely of federal controls, there is regulations, not just a general permit that applies under certain circumstances, but there's actual requirements that ensure that each and every operator have to take all of these steps to reduce their emissions. And it's something that, has not in any way hindered those industries in those states, So even if there are individual operators that are not currently doing that would have to do that, we have not seen anything like, a collapse or even a diminishment of the industry practices as a result of those emission reduction measures. And that's what we want to see here in Pennsylvania.
John?
Thank you for your question. I may have to ask you to repeat the first, but I would say when it comes to this, we need, I guess it's important to think about.
My question for you.
Please.
Oh, I was just going to say, my question for you was, you said about the mom and pops, you don't want them to basically let the unconventional guys go too. My question is, I get what you're getting at, because they produce more production in Pennsylvania, the unconventionals. Would you support a separate conventional oil and gas act then, that lets them be in a different category altogether?
Well, I appreciate the question. I mean, I think we have the apparatus in place with DEP to move through with a policy. I don't really wade into the legislative space, so I mean, that's something I'd have to talk about. But I mean, I think you see in this room stakeholders engaged in this process, so I think we have the way to take into consideration those operational variances and I guess the special circumstances. So I mean, I think there's lessons out there, states that have done things, and so I think when you have DEP with the technical experience, having done this for more than a decade, we rely on them to kind of pull all of the people together to make sound policy.
Thank you. Rep. Isaacson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And actually, following up on that, I was interested in finding out, what did other states do? I understand part of this discussion today has been about, further protections the state can do to protect the environment outside of the federal government regulations, which we all have acknowledged can change. So what did some other states do? And especially as we are moving forward with the debate of the data center explosion, our energy crisis, and whether you agree with it or not, we are a gas-producing state. So I could see what the argument being made that as we're demanding more for producing energy for households as well as the industries that are coming, what have other states done and, under their own state laws that perhaps might be beneficial to us?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. So in 2014, before EPA took any actions on methane, Colorado adopted comprehensive methane requirements that they've subsequently strengthened multiple times for both new and existing sources of oil and gas that required them to do a lot of these practices that we've recommended. So oil and gas operators have to go and regularly inspect all of the components at their well sites and in compressor stations to determine that there aren't equipment leaks, because these things often leak. You can have, you know, a valve left open or a thief hatch left open, and that can sometimes really result in huge emission events. There are certain limitations, and I should sense after Colorado did that, California again in I think 2019, and then New Mexico in 2021 or 2022. So these are all states, and you know they are able to submit these programs as part of their, you know, as part of the federal plan to EPA. So it's not so much these state and federal requirements can work in tandem. It's just that the state requirements will operate no matter what happens federally. So even if EPA abandons all of these efforts, the Colorado, New Mexico, and California regs that they adopted under their own state law, just separate from federal requirements, will still apply. And so I think that's really what we want to see. Is we want DEP to, you know, work on this federal plan, submit it to EPA, but to do so, you know, develop comprehensive standards within state law, which they have to do anyway. I mean, all of these states have to adopt authorities, you know, adopt regs through their own authorities, submit those regs as a plan to the federal government. You know, but what we want to see DEP do is basically do the same kinds of things we saw in those other 3 states, which is, you know, consider, and again, the Biden era 2024 emission guidelines are a great blueprint for this, and they can't be any weaker than that if they submit it, you know, to EPA. But those are basically lay down all of these sorts of techniques, like, you know, well and compressor station inspections, the use of non-emitting pumps and process controllers, limitations on flaring of associated gas and oil wells. Those kinds of things are basically the kinds of practices, techniques, and technologies that DEP can adopt through its own authorities, similar to what these other states have done. And then, you know, it's again like that's something that is parallel to the federal requirements. They can submit that as a federal plan. Those federal plans are now due in January. And so that's what I think would be the best approach forward.
Oh, okay. You don't have to answer.
The only thing I'd like to put is, I mean, I think you can learn lessons from what you've seen. I think you've watched the industry grow in these states that have put these regulations forward. So I think there is a good way to approach it, and you just have to look at this as a Pennsylvania-specific opportunity. I think from an economic competitive angle, I think your operators are going to have a chance, I think, to stand out to global markets and have access there and kind of continue their industry. But the more we control waste, I mean, you have to look at this as a waste issue also. And so any lost molecule of methane and something that's not brought to sale is something that is not available to consumers. So we have to consider how we can reduce that waste and realize that a lot of the things that are driving the natural gas price increases are not related to that. As far as the EIA is concerned, that's related to LNG exports and the data centers' power demands. So if gas is going to be used here to power the data centers, while we think it should be clean energy, I would say just have to consider the responsible development of that gas.
Okay, thank you. We have just a little bit of time left in this segment, so if our final questioner, Rep. Day, can be brief, and the respondents can also be brief, so we can speak stay relatively on schedule. Rep. Day.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Guys, thanks for your testimony. I think you do an outstanding job of engagement, and I'd like to talk to you more offline. So if you'd reach out to my office about, I think one of you mentioned capturing methane for resource generation. I thought that was interesting, and also just generally clean air for Pennsylvanians are things I'm interested in. But to stay in line with the chairman's intent today, Pennsylvania natural gas industry, I believe I've heard a few times, produces energy with a much lower methane intensity than most other gas producing areas, I think. And I just want your thoughts on that part of that fact leading up to my question. Would you say that if that's true, then a national policy that would encourage use of Pennsylvania natural gas more than the other ones, would you consider that to be a policy that would be reducing methane in the atmosphere?
That's an interesting question. You know, that would have to be something done, obviously, at the federal level. and I think it would have to happen through legislation. I don't know, John, do you have any thoughts on that?
Appreciate the question.
And guys, I want to just frame it up quicker, just for on the chair, to help the chairman with his time issues. And, what I'm really looking at, it might be tough for you guys to say this, but what I'm hearing is that, we do have an administration who's being, talked about today, I'll just say, and the administration is doing things right now that encourages energy to be purchased from the United States right now. And I'm just curious if it's true that Pennsylvania natural gas is, I don't want to say cleaner, I'm not qualified to say that, but it has been said much lower methane intensity, what we're talking about today, then would I see the Sierra Club and other environmental groups come out and say, we like that we're using energy from areas that produce it with less methane being released. That's kind of to really get it to a point.
I think I understand the question. We are under time constraints. Let's just let the presenters respond.
Thanks, Chairman.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I honestly can't, and I would have to put some more thought into this, because I haven't really thought about at a state level how, methane intensity, the differences from one state to another. But it's something that we'll certainly look into.
Hey guys, thanks, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. And guys, if one of you guys could reach out to me about those other topics, I'd appreciate it. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you both for testifying. Really appreciate it. Our next speaker will be Todd Pepisergi, who is with the Pennsylvania Independent Oil and Gas Association, and accompanying him for the purpose of helping with questions that are posed is also Dan Weaver, president of PIOGA. So, Todd, this will be a 15-minute segment with Todd presenting for 8 minutes, and then the balance will be questions answered by the two of you in tandem. Okay, so Todd, you can go when ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Vitale, Chairman Rader, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. The testimony of the Pennsylvania Independent Oil and Gas Association has been submitted for the record. In the interest of time, we'll keep our remarks brief so that there is adequate time for questions. I want to begin with a point of agreement. Methane emissions should be reduced where practical, effective, and based on real-world conditions. The industry understands that methane is both an environmental concern and also a valuable energy product. Capturing methane means cleaner operations and more energy reaching consumers. The issue before Pennsylvania today is not whether methane should be addressed. It clearly should be. The issue is whether federal regulations and the state adoption of those designed around very different operations will be imposed here in a way that harms Pennsylvania's consumers. Pennsylvania's oil and gas sector is not one industry. We have world-class unconventional shale development, a large conventional natural gas industry that supplies local gas, and Pennsylvania-grade crude oil production that remains nationally important in a variety of different industrial sectors. These sectors have different economics, different infrastructure, and different operating realities. A one-size-fits-all regulatory model simply does not work in this space. Representative Kephart has, in his questioning already today, has made this very apt. However, right now, as DEP is proposing it through a general permitting process to adopt federal regulations under subpart Quad OC, separate considerations are not part of the state plan. It is right now a one-size-fits-all model. And that means that the greatest concern here is really for Pennsylvania's most vulnerable and their ability to obtain local natural gas. Many Pennsylvanians, especially in rural communities, rely on natural gas produced close to where it is consumed through small local systems that have served homes, farms, schools, churches, and businesses for generations. In many parts of northern and western Pennsylvania, local gas is the primary heating source. More than half of Pennsylvania households use natural gas as their main home heating fuel. People's Natural Gas, for example, uses over 40% of local gas to produce to its customers. Federal Subpart Quad OC threatens that affordability if Pennsylvania does not use flexibility that Pennsylvania may have under the rule. Many conventional wells in Pennsylvania produce small volumes that the cost of compliance can exceed the revenues the wells generate. When that happens, those wells cannot modernize. They will, unfortunately, be shut down. And when enough wells shut down, consumers will feel that impact immediately. Families will lose access to affordable local gas. Farms and small businesses will lose reliable heating fuel. Communities are pushed towards higher cost alternatives, such as propane, fuel oil, or electric resistance heat. In many cases, that also means paying for new tanks, new appliances, electrical upgrades, or other property modifications just to keep the heat on. This burden will fall hardest on our rural communities, those communities that have retirees on fixed incomes, working families, and low-income households already struggling with utility bills. Pennsylvania does not have to choose between environmental progress and affordability. Subpart Quad OC gives states flexibility. Pennsylvania can focus resources on higher emitting sources, use practical alternatives for low-producing wells, such as audio, visual, and olfactory inspections, along with the already existing monthly integrity reports, or even lower cost monitoring methods while also accounting for economic feasibility and remaining useful life of the wells themselves. That is the path Pennsylvania should be on. Target real emissions problems, protect consumers, preserve affordable local energy, and recognize that different sectors require different regulatory treatment. Our closing point here is simple. Methane regulation should reduce emissions, not raise heating bills. It should protect the environment, not undermine energy access. And it should reflect Pennsylvania's unique energy landscape, not impose assumptions imported from somewhere else. Mr. Weaver and I thank you, and we welcome your questions.
Thank you. Rep. Isaacson?
Thank you. I appreciated your testimony, especially, I agree with my colleague, Representative Kephart, that, we have an industry or industries that all kind of operate and seem to get lumped in together. I'm not necessarily against, if we did something, it being a one-size-fits-all. We're in the business of making legislation, and the sausage is not always very pretty to watch. But that's why we have these public hearings. So listening to your testimony, and by the way, you left out Philadelphia, the largest urban center that has a huge gas usage. And, certainly we've been going through a situation with utilities and their infrastructure upgrades that they need to make, but that was going to be passed on to ratepayers. And certainly, we've all heard the pushback from certainly our caucus, but also the governor with regard to that. So I do understand where you're coming from, but unfortunately, saying that we're going to somehow take and make gas unavailable because somebody has to upgrade, because they're always going to need to upgrade. There's no such thing as just keeping your infrastructure status quo. So that's kind of the sausage that we're talking about. How are we going to make it environmentally sound and try and help, but also make sure that companies, whether they're a mom and pop or whether they're a big industry here, can be compliant, and if that's regulations on the state level outside of just the federal requirements, which doesn't sound like you're all thrilled to begin with, is that something that you think is a path we could go down where we would be addressing the issues for the different size companies? I'm not going to say that you're going to give me testimony saying I'm all for you regulating us, but because certainly no one wants more regulations. I hear it all the time. But I also want clean air and clean water. And we all know we're having energy issues. So this is just going to come to the forefront. So to jump down on my question, which I'm sure Representative Gephardt's going to be happy to hear. Would you be supportive if we go down some path that we call it out in different segments with regard to the different industries that are operating in this?
100% yes.
Yes.
We already have Act 52 that's in place that mandates that when it comes to oil and gas operations, DEP has to consider the conventional and the unconventional industries separately. I do think that Pyoga and our members would support even a step further, especially when it comes to air regulations, because both not just the economic but also the industrial aspect of it are so wholly different. And Mr. Weaver can touch on it even more so than I can.
Yeah, I think we completely agree. One thing I'd like to point out is we understand the issue that you're facing over there with your utilities, right? And that's a separate side of things, right? So we today are addressing the wells. Those are the price takers. So the utilities have the way to recover those costs. And whether we agree with what that looks like through rate cases or not, different hearing, right? What we're addressing right now is these wells that have been in place, potentially for 10 to 50, 60, 70 years. They take whatever the market's doing. They have no way to recover those costs that are then becoming put on top of them. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we come down to is simply just adjusting the way we monitor this. We are already out there doing mechanical well integrity that we have to turn in quarterly, right? So when Mr. Papasergi said, instead of using these cameras that cost upwards of $100,000, if you can get one, why don't we already use our methane monitoring that we're already doing? We're not against that part. We're against the way that they want to change the technology, because that automatically makes that well uneconomical by day one.
Thank you. Rep. Gephardt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for indulging my third question of the day. But I have a question for Pyoga here about, so if we do this, LDAR testing that DEP one potential thing wanted to do, they're estimating that this could cost $3,000 per well. Some of these stripper wells that they have in the conventional industry are lucky to make $3,000 per year on the entire well. If they do that, it would effectively end the small mom and pop conventional wells that are producing low amounts, but I will say high quality grade crude oil, such as we have in the Northwest. I mean, some of the best in the world. That is a deep concern of mine. Could you expand further on this? I mean, it's not economical if the regulation literally is going to cost more than the well produces. So, and I appreciate Representative Isaacson's somewhat, concurrence, I'll say, in this problem.
So I appreciate the question, Representative. I think you're exactly right. And to expand on it, as Mr. Weaver said, these optical gas imaging cameras, if you can even find them, cost upwards of $100,000. Then you have to train people to use them. And the $3,000 per well is a low estimate on our end. So yes, they will render these conventional wells, many of them, simply uneconomical. When it comes to both the conventional oil and conventional gas industry, if they become uneconomical, now you may have an even larger environmental problem on your hands, because these wells likely then will need to be abandoned and plugged, and you're now putting the very people out of business that the state contracts with or uses to plug wells. That's the conventional industry. There's no one else out there to plug these wells. You're putting them out of business at that point. Not to mention the fact that then you are also, with all due respect, especially in the northern and western part of the state, you are going to have them lose the ability to receive local gas. I don't disagree that there needs to be, in times, technological advancements. I don't disagree with that one bit. But it can be done in a way that takes the economics of especially the conventional industry into consideration. And while Representative Isaacson, you talked about we don't really like the federal rule, we don't mind the federal rule. There actually are ways that the federal rule can be used to make it economically viable for this methane reduction to occur. The problem we have right now is Pennsylvania, under the proposed state plan for Quad OC, is not doing it. That's why we're here today.
Thank you. Rep. Webster.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to start by recognizing I'm highly cynical about a lot of the discussions that happen in this complex of buildings. And so bear with me. When I hear, that something's economically unfeasible, part of my brain is also saying, except we're amortize it over 23 years and we'll write it off on our taxes. So I understand that while regulations create costs, there's a lot of ways for an industry or for a small business to account for those things in our tax codes and other ways. So I'm not as discouraged as maybe you made it seem. Completely different question, the same level of cynicism. When I look at the organization of the way, and this is my education over a few years in this role, our Department of Environmental Protection and industry associate with each other. If I designed it from the ground up, I would follow a more federal model. I'd have an Environmental Protection Agency completely separate from an energy department, right? Putting them together makes leadership in those organizations of two minds, and it makes it difficult. Having said that, I think industry's had a large role in the way DEP has put this together in the beginning. Stakeholders matter in that regard. So the one-size-fits-all model was generated by, as much academic research as lobbying and stakeholder input. Now we want to, and it sounds reasonable, that these industries should be separate. But what's changed? Why, from your perspective, the business model should be changing like that?
Actually, there wasn't as much input in the beginning as you would think, Representative. They adopted the plan from the federal and realized that they were already behind the gun. And as you heard the DEP say earlier, they knew that they were in a time crunch. Had it not been extended, these plans were due March of this year. And they were extended by the federal government last summer as far as when it was due. DEP had known about this, and they didn't move forward with it because there were other things that they were focused on until they realized where the timeline was. And so at that point in time, they put out their state plan almost this point in time last year. In May last year, opened it up for comment period through the middle of July into June, and it was where it was at, and that was the first bite at the apple we had, along with the other folks that are, constituents and within the Commonwealth. So there wasn't as much input into this plan based on Pennsylvania data as you would think. It's literally 186 pages, almost direct copy. There's only like 15 lines that vary between the Pennsylvania plan and the federal plan.
Oh, okay. Okay, we are at the
and I apologize.
beyond
Thanks,
the 15.
Chairman.
We are on beyond the 15-minute point. Rep Day, if you promise to ask a one-sentence question, we can extend this a little bit, and if the presenters promise to be quick, but just like one, possibly two-sentence question, Rep Day, and so we can move along.
So these well owners supply local gas, they plug the wells for us, and PA and Pennsylvania's DEP is allowed to apply different standards of performance for a class of facilities like this. So, I think that's what I heard from today. I tried to jot down notes, and my question would be, is it based on it? They can decide this if it's physically impossible, technically infeasible, and is it based on emissions as well, or just on those standards? So that's my question. Thanks, Chairman. And I appreciate that, listening to some questions today, and I conveniently get curbed, so I appreciate
Okay,
that.
you know what, Rep Day, just keep going. Ask a full question. I don't want to curb you.
Sure. So, Representative, thank you for the question, and you're correct on the technical and physical aspects and the impossibility. What it's based on, essentially, is the cost to remove a ton of methane from the atmosphere or to capture a ton of methane. EPA came out with guidelines in that regard. It's about $2,500 per ton. So if the cost of compliance exceeds $2,500 per ton, then there are economic considerations that can be done at both the state and federal level to bring no reduction. No compliance, but reduced compliance. Again, to keep methane out of the atmosphere, but to do it in an economically responsible manner.
Yeah, and that was one of the things that we asked DEP to look into, which is the remaining useful life and other considerations. And at the current way it's written, it does not take that into consideration.
Okay. Rep. Day, did you have another question? Rep. Day.
I would not, I probably shouldn't speak anymore, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you both for coming here today. We really appreciate it. Enjoyed your testimony. Thank you for coming today.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman.
Great. Okay, our final panel will be Josh Eisenfeld from Earthworks and Alice Liu from Clean Air Council. So give you a minute to get settled.
Yeah, should I go first? Alice, I think you're there in person.
And okay, and either of you can go first. Don't care.
Okay, I can go first. There were slides I had prepared. I don't know if Haley is on and can provide those.
Let's see.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Cool, I'll get going. My name is Josh Eisenfeld. I'm a resident of the 34th District of Pennsylvania and a lifelong resident of Pennsylvania and a fourth generation Pennsylvanian. So I want to say thank you to all of you for being here, but especially to my state rep, Abigail Salisbury. But more importantly, for this discussion, I am the Oil and Gas Research and Accountability Manager at Earthworks. Earthworks' mission is to protect communities and the environment from adverse impacts of mineral and energy development while promoting sustainable solutions. I'm here to share the result of our white paper published in partnership with Gas Leaks project titled Oil and Gas Methane Emissions in Appalachia. This was a year-long satellite monitoring project using Carbon Mapper's publicly available satellite data. And the big picture takeaway is this. While the industry leaders often claim this region has the lowest methane intensity in the country, our data in the report tells a very different story. Next slide. To understand why this matters, we have to talk a little bit about methane, which I know has been discussed today already, but it's an invisible, odorless gas that is a climate powerhouse, trapping 80 times more heat than CO2 on a 20-year period. Methane doesn't just leak, it is polluted at every stage of the oil and gas production. This pollution is accelerating the rate of climate change and affecting frontline communities. Methane emissions represent a massive drain on resources, but they can be stopped if we use the technology available to see them. For over a decade, Earthworks has been doing exactly that, detecting and recording methane pollution in the field using optical gas imaging cameras. I'm actually one of 7 Earthworks staffers who are certified optical gas imaging thermographer with the Infrared Training Center, and this is the industry standard for certification for optical gas imaging. Over the last few years, I've also led our efforts to incorporate satellite-based methane detections into our ongoing work to track, attribute, and act on methane pollution from the oil and gas basins across the country. Next slide, please. Alongside Gas Leaks project, we use this new data from satellites to examine an important discrepancy between industry self-reporting and real-world emissions. So for example, the Appalachian Methane Initiative, whose financial supporters include Expand Energy and EQT, state that the Appalachian Basin is the lowest emitting major oil and gas basin in the region in the United States. However, a report in 2026 by McKay et al. In a peer-reviewed scientific journal called Atmospheric Chemistry and Physics tells a very different story. Their analysis of methane air data, which is a different but similar sensor to the one that we use in our project, reveals that the Appalachian Basin is actually the second most polluting basin after the Permian. You can see that. So the takeaway here is that the methane emissions reported to the EPA by operators themselves, depicted in gray, remain significantly lower than the measured emissions observed, which is depicted in blue in the little square we have here. And as a result of that, the industry supported assertion that Pennsylvania produces the lowest methane intensity gas should be subject to a lot more scrutiny. Satellite data, conveniently, provides another growing body of evidence against their claims. Next slide. Now let's talk a little bit about the methods and tools we use, the satellites. There are a number of state-of-the-art emission sensing satellites out there. For this report, we use data from Planet Labs' Tanager 1 satellite, made available via Carbon Mapper's online portal. The Tanager 1 satellite was launched in August of 2024 and began its measurements just a month later. It doesn't see colors like we do, but instead identifies the unique light absorption fingerprint of methane. These satellites orbit hundreds of miles above us, and some have very, very wide areas of focus, and some have very narrow and precise areas of focus. Those are called point source imagers. The Tanager 1 has a 30-meter resolution, and that's precise enough to look at a specific valley in Pennsylvania and point to the exact well pad or compressor station that is venting gas. Next slide. This is a basic illustration of how point source imaging satellites like Tanager work. OGI cameras and satellites are actually quite similar in the sense they're designed to look at the atmosphere and see the infrared light wavelengths absorbed by specific gases. In this case, we're looking at the specific spectrum of methane, and you'll see this little GIF shows you the imaging process. Next slide, please. Our data was collected between November 1st, 2024 and early November 2025, covering the gas-producing regions of Pennsylvania, northern West Virginia, and eastern Ohio. And during this period, Carbon Mapper's data portal identified 96 methane plumes from 70 distinct oil and gas sources. As shown on the map, our analysis cross-referenced these plume locations with publicly available facility records, and that includes records from the PADEP, the EPA, the EIA, FERC, and many others. This process was extremely intensive, and explaining it won't really fit into the 8 minutes, but I'd be happy to speak with anyone about this process and provide more information at any time. Next slide. With this robust data set, we were able to successfully attribute 57 of these plumes to specific facilities and operators with a high level of certainty. And I'd also be happy to follow up more about this and the exact plumes at another time too. So next slide. From these 57 attributed methane emission sources, we conducted analysis on size, persistence, and frequency on an operator by operator basis, but also overall. And what we found was concerning. Notably, approximately 90% of the documented plumes meet the EPA's definition of super emitter event, which means it exceed 100 kilograms of methane per hour. To put that in perspective, if just one of these plumes of that magnitude continues for a full day, it would be equal to the equivalent of 42 US cars driving for a year, for each plume, for each day. That's if it's at 100 kilograms per hour. So if many of these were well over that, and you can do the math from there too. While some of these events may be relatively short-lived, many of these plumes were also detected emitting from multiple days. While operators continue to make the claims about their methane reduction efforts, actions, and data should speak a lot louder than their words. The data we analyzed reinforces the point that the current reporting provides an incomplete picture of our methane pollution problem. Next slide. So the bad news is that large emission releases are occurring regularly across the state of Pennsylvania, even from companies claiming to have low or zero emissions. The good news is that we have many tools we can use to stop that from happening. We encourage the state not to take the companies at their word, but for the protection of our resources and our environment, check their words with all the tools we have available. Satellites are a publicly available tool for immediate use by the state to provide more oversight and reduce methane emissions. Next slide. We recommend Pennsylvania add satellites to its toolbox for identifying and addressing methane emissions from the oil and gas industry. Again, methane is invisible and odorless, and because of this, it can be emitted in enormous quantities and still go unreported or unaddressed without proper oversight. It's time for Pennsylvania to modernize methane regulations and make satellite data a regular part of the inspection and enforcement process for our state. Next slide, which is to say thank you for the time.
Thank you, Josh. Appreciate that. Alice?
right. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Chair Vitale and members of the House Environmental and Natural Resource Protection Committee. I thank you for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Alice Liu. I'm the policy analyst at Clean Air Council. Clean Air Council is a member-supported environmental and health nonprofit with offices on both sides of the state. The council works to protect everyone's right to a clean and healthy environment. As we've heard a lot today already, Pennsylvania is the country's second largest gas producing state. So in 2024, gas produced in Pennsylvania accounted for about 20% of the United States' total gas output. And we all know that Pennsylvania is a proud energy exporter. However, Pennsylvania is also equally well positioned to lead in environmental and health protections while promoting economic development. Gas development is well documented to contribute to environmental and health harming pollution, which hurts Pennsylvanians and wastes gas product. I'll be speaking today to the environmental and health damages that emissions from the oil and gas industry can cause, as well as the Environmental Protection Agency's methane rule as an existing, common sense policy lever that can better protect Pennsylvanians. The Commonwealth can lead the nation by adopting strong methane standards that balance environmental and health safeguards alongside responsible economic development. So fracked gas, as we've also heard a lot today, primarily consists of methane, which is a commodity when captured, but a powerful greenhouse gas when released. Given Pennsylvania's role as a leader in energy production, especially shale gas production, methane emissions from the oil and gas industry contribute significantly to the Commonwealth's greenhouse gas emissions. According to the DEP's most recent greenhouse gas inventory, estimated emissions from the industrial sector accounted for nearly 31% of Pennsylvania's greenhouse gas emissions, and of this sector's emissions, 19% can be attributed to oil and gas processes. However, as we've seen from Josh's presentation here, this number also likely underestimates actual emissions. So reducing methane pollution, particularly from the oil and gas sector, can be one of the fastest, most cost-effective ways to rapidly slow climate change. Recent global data from MethaneSat underscores the fact that reported emissions estimates systematically underestimate actual methane emissions. The absolute emissions from basins that predominantly produce gas were 3 times higher than reported estimated emissions, with low-producing wells especially contributing significantly to overall emissions in several basins. These small marginal wells, in particular, can benefit greatly from enhanced measures that reduce emissions and save gas product. Much of the research on emissions from marginal well sites in the U.S. has found that these sites could be responsible for over 50% of the oil and gas sector's methane emissions. And we know that methane emissions happen randomly, right? They can't be predicted necessarily, and that's why it's imperative to enhance leak detection and repair procedures so that these leaks can be detected, found, and fixed. Furthermore, methane is a precursor to ground-level ozone, which we know is also referred to as smog. This harms human health, and science-based, peer-reviewed air modeling has estimated that 35% of the global ground-level ozone is attributable to methane emissions. Exposure to ground-level ozone can lead to coughing and sore throat, difficulty breathing, worsened respiratory diseases, increased risk of asthma attack, and even a greater risk for premature death. In addition to methane, fracked gas also includes other hydrocarbons, like volatile organic compounds and hazardous air pollutants. We've heard today already presentations about why these harm health, but their impacts include risks of cancer, worsened respiratory disease and immune system, neurological, reproductive, and developmental harms. So nearly 1.5 million Pennsylvanians live within just half a mile of an active oil or gas well, compressor station, or processing plant. So these are the people living closest to upstream and midstream gas infrastructure and are disproportionately exposed to the pollution from these sources. Therefore, reducing methane emissions from oil and gas sources has immense potential to also reduce health-harming co-pollutants that millions of Pennsylvanians are exposed to, and thereby also saving residents costs on healthcare visits in the long term. And I'll bring it back to the Environmental Protection Agency's methane rule as an existing framework that can help reduce methane emissions and save gas product. This rule was finalized in March of 2024, and it aims to curb the emissions of methane and associated pollutants from the oil and gas industry through the use of readily available and cost-effective technologies. If fully implemented, this rule would phase out routine flaring. It would require the adoption of emissions-free process controllers. It would bolster monitoring requirements and hold operators accountable to the timely repair of any leaks. The monitoring of a well site is also required up until a site is closed, with a final instrument-based survey of that site required to make sure there are no remaining emissions. So this provision in itself, I think, is also a useful tool in tackling the ongoing issue of well abandonment in the state. So states are now in the process of determining how they plan to meet these emissions guidelines set forth in the EPA rule for existing upstream and midstream oil and gas infrastructure. And if you take away anything from my testimony today, implementing the methane rule is an opportunity. It's an opportunity for Pennsylvania to balance leading health and environmental protections alongside domestic gas production by preventing wasted gas. Tackling methane emissions from the oil and gas systems in Pennsylvania is a win-win. It prevents the waste of methane, which is a gas product that companies sell, and it protects Pennsylvanians from being exposed to emissions that harm their health and the environment. So by adopting strong methane standards through the methane rule, Pennsylvania has the opportunity to lead the nation in instituting common sense protections that reduce methane waste. Thank you.
Okay. Do we have any questions? Huh? Rep Day, we have 8 minutes for you if you want to ask a question. Well, thank you very much. Thank you. Your testimony was great. I think it's probably a function of just being exhausted with the technical aspects of the testimony for the past 2 hours. It probably is why you didn't have questions. But your testimony was great, and thank you both. Thank you both for participating today. We really appreciate it. Okay. That concludes our hearing for the day. I think we had excellent speakers. We had a lot of valuable testimony, and I just want to thank all who participated and all who viewed either remotely or at home. And any of your members want to? Okay. And with that, the hearing's concluded.